will take off at other places around the country. There are a number of MSA Multidisciplinary clinics now. Some of my colleagues earlier, and the MSA Coalition is working hard to define some of the best practices.
That's me. Sorry, I will turn that off. I'm having trouble listening to my.
I think we'll take some questions and
Stop. Stop talking.
All right, so I think we're live now. I was asked to remind people, if you have questions, you might want to use the chat feature so that we can all see them. I'm joined by my other speakers for this session.
And before we start to get questions, let me say that I'm Carol Langer. I'm with the MSA Coalition, and I want to thank Dr. Bernino, Dr. Kuhn, and Dr. McFarland for doing these fabulous presentations, and also for this great effort. I mean, all three of these folks are on our medical advisory board. We are working really hard to try to get this whole project off the ground, and I think it's going to be fabulous. Okay, where are the questions? So, do we have questions here? Maybe, maybe not. So we do have one person who says, I would love to have a team of doctors like this for my husband. He was diagnosed and sent home to our PCP. They said nothing more we can do. And I won't embarrass this person by saying who that person is, but boy, we hear that a lot at the MSA Coalition. And, so we have a question, how many centers are there in Eastern United States? Right now, there are no centers, but there are about to be. We're going to have the questionnaire ready very shortly, and we will be taking applications, and we will be getting them off the ground. And our initial plan certainly is to have them dispersed throughout the United States. Stay tuned. There will be some in the Eastern United States. I can almost tell you, but I don't want to say it until we actually go through the process.
Well, that's another part of the issue, is that there are, a number of centers who have organized to deliver multidisciplinary care, but we don't know who they all are and what stage they're at. So there are, the people on this call that we all know each other and what we're up to, and probably 5 or 6 other places that we are, in touch with. But I know there are others who would like to organize something. And again, we're just trying to create a framework and some guidelines based on our past experiences, both good and bad, some things we tried that didn't work and so on, so that it's less hard every time someone wants to create something new.
Well,
yeah, I would just add, I think one thing I didn't really mention it in my talk really was, the point really that we want to actually, in designating centers in the United States, we actually want to think about centers in different geographic locations. So I didn't make that point clear, but I think the goal will really be to try to reach as many people as possible. And so, that will be part of the designation process. So centers, we don't want centers right next to each other ideally. So. Right.
So, and we have another comment, not a question, but need to comment on how difficult it is to navigate all the caregiving duties. I need a quarterback for all the planning and coordinating. Well, this would certainly help with that. Will it take a referral from another doctor to come to one of these centers? It's going to depend on what the centers are and how that works. I would hope that people could just refer themselves, but I anticipate there will be demand for this. So perhaps there will need to be referrals. Is there a center for a team in Boston? There's not a center anywhere yet, but certainly I can't. So I'm from Boston. I cannot imagine, knowing the skills we have in Boston, that there won't be a center in Boston. Let's see. I've got a lot of questions about MSA and onset and progress, and I will answer that if we run out of other questions. But I really want to talk about what was talked about today.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, Steve, your presentation was really great, and I think same with Dr. Kuhn. The presentations were wonderful, and it really kind of provides a great example of sort of what a center could look like.
Yeah.
And a great example for patients to kind of see, and a good example to set for kind of what are we looking for as a center going forward. And centers are going to be different. Okay. So that's a point that I think should be made, but I think that's sort of an ideal and a standard that we kind of want to achieve. But to show the teamwork was fantastic and how it's sort of organized.
And I think it's also important with centers that we can really share best practices. Like we have learned so much from Dr. Bernino and the UT Southwestern group, and they've been so open to what has worked and what doesn't. But we could really do that on a bigger scale with these centers of excellence.
And that absolutely is the plan. We have having a bunch of, this is good. Thank you all for participating in the questions. It's fabulous. A suggestion from a patient who suggests that more attention is given to the role of the ophthalmologist, or in this case, probably the neuro-ophthalmologist, in treatment of MSA. Double vision is dangerous and disabling. And not everybody has it, but for those people who do have it, first of all, you completely lose the ability to read. And it's disabling in everyday life. So I agree with this particular comment. But since not everybody's affected, not everybody would need to see a neuro-ophthalmologist. So
yeah, I think it's as we alluded to, there's kind of a core team of providers that need to be involved, and probably another 5 or 6 specialties that may need to be engaged as needed. And part of our job is to reach out to those people that and we're not asking them to commit to being at the clinic every time, but just and I think it hasn't been hard to find colleagues who are willing to make some time for our MSA patients when we need them. But it's good to have kind of laid the foundation for that in advance, including
So someone just asked if these 3 doctors would anticipate applying. I can answer for them. Yes. They're setting the standards, and they will certainly help. They will certainly apply. There's not a center in Portland, Oregon at this moment, but that doesn't mean that there won't be, because we have, and there's not a center in Atlanta. And so we have to, I can't answer these questions yet because we're still figuring that stuff out. And a bunch of questions about getting into clinical trials and how that happens, and also a bunch of questions about progression and how you know where you are in the progression. And maybe sort of generally you could speak to that.
Yeah. Great.
Liz, you want to take that one?
Yes. Speaking of clinical trials, I would say the first place to start is clinicaltrials.gov and type in multiple system atrophy. And then you can see all of the clinical trials that are available in the entire world. And you can sort by which ones are active. And then there will be a contact person listed if it's something that you're interested in. I always advise my patients to look whether it is a kind of a learning trial, meaning just trying to uncover information, versus a treatment trial. And you might have different wishes about whether you'd want to be involved in one or the other. But then I would say reach out to the contact person that's usually a research coordinator that is listed on that website. Do you want me to talk on prognosis or onset?
Oh, sure. Yeah, why not? You're in a roll.
So as for an onset of symptoms, this can be really hard because things usually start gradually. Not every time, but most of the time it's a pretty gradual onset. So we usually have the patients look back to say, okay, when were you last normal? And what was the first thing that you noticed was off? And then we try and sort out, was it a motor or movement issue, like incoordination or balance, or was it more autonomic, like a blood pressure drop, passing out, or bladder issue, like incontinence? And so that's usually how we go back to that onset of symptoms. And it can be hard with that recall, trying to remember. Other people remember very crisply when things first started to become off. As for prognosis, this is really hard to predict. We have some really good trials that have looked prospectively and given numbers, but where to put any one person in that is difficult. Usually we say the pace of disease tends to be the same for one person. So one person might have more of a slow progressing disease. Another person may have more of a faster progressing disease. And that's something that we often follow over time. So looking at multiple assessments over time to get a better idea where any individual might fall. I'd love to hear what others do with that question.
Yeah, I think it's a balance between being very honest with people that this is a progressive, ultimately fatal disease as it stands right now, but also not to make the case that there's nothing to do. What we're talking about this afternoon is that there are things to do. There are things to improve quality of life and to improve people's function for as long as possible. And so I think it's, at least in my view, not a great idea to tell people, okay, you have 3.5 years, because we don't know that answer. As Liz said, it may differ from different people. Probably in general terms, and this is true of a lot of diseases, the tempo of the worsening for a particular patient tends to stay true. People who getting worse quickly often get worse quickly, and those who progress more slowly do so more slowly. That sounds stupid, but that's kind of the way we look at things. And that, again, helps. These are not one reason we can't answer that question at the first visit, because we only have one time point that we're interacting with you as a patient and haven't got the sense of the way the disease is going.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you guys. There's always a hard question, I think everyone knows I wish we had that crystal ball sometimes to know. We can quote numbers that are published in terms of how long people in general, on average, sort of survive from sort of the disease onset to the end. But those numbers don't always apply on an individual basis. So sometimes I think it's really important we kind of ask to step back and kind of ask sort of what's driving the question. And I think sometimes it's sort of the fears. What do patients expect going to happen? Are they afraid of how are they going to die? What are the complications that are actually going to happen? Is there going to be pain? So there are sometimes some underlying questions or fears that patients have. Have they had this conversation with other family members of their diagnosis and what it means for them? And then just talking about sort of how the disease progresses in general, and begin a conversation sort of about planning. How do they see their life going? How do they want to best live? And then bringing a kind of, have you thought about how you want the end of your life to be as well? And bringing up those questions sometimes can be important for us as physicians, just to bring that up again. It's part of the disease, part of life, and something just to bring out in the open some of those fears and concerns from some of our patients. So.
Okay, let's switch gears switch gears. More questions about clinical trials. Is there anything in Canada? We've had a question about Germany. We've had a question about China. Again, I would refer people to clinicaltrials.gov, which literally does cover the whole world. And there are ways within clinicaltrials.gov to search on active trials and to search on trials by location, I believe by country, but certainly. Yeah. And I do suggest doing that. It is, as with many very detailed databases, it can be kind of awkward to search, but hang in there, because that's the best source of information.
Yeah, Carol, I was going to say, I like clinical trials myself, but I do have a number of people. It's not the most user-friendly site for people who aren't used to searching databases. And there are a lot of filters with it. So you can pull up a lot of trials, but many of them are not active. So I love your site. I think MSA Coalition has a good pointer and probably a good starting point too, and more down to earth, shall I say, kind of descriptions of studies and that are ongoing. And that could be a good resource for folks too, to kind of start there. And then I would just say, feel free to reach out to us as practitioners, send us emails, messages, and we can kind of guide you, and we can tell you which one of those trials are ongoing. Some of them are probably not, have completed enrollment, and can also tell you, maybe give you a little insight as to what trials may be coming to look for as well. So just hints.
And actually, I should have put a plug in for the MSA Coalition's research pipeline, because we do have an excellent research pipeline on our website. And if you all haven't been there, I suggest A, checking out the whole website, but B, certainly checking out the research pipeline, because it's color coded. It is much more user friendly, but may not give the same location detail as. So you have to use the two, kind of. Okay, will the Centers of Excellence offer telemedicine?
Well, Carol, I was going to mention, because I see a few messages there. I just wanted to clarify that in addition to us, I think this is true of my colleagues, that having a multiple system atrophy longitudinal multidisciplinary clinic, we are all still in the business of doing neurological consultations for patients. So one does not have to be enrolled in the center to come get evaluated, determine if you have MSA, determine what the right treatment plan is, even if you live far away and can't commit to being part of a long-term care. What we're talking about here this afternoon is really, what about those patients who we try to coordinate their care because they live close enough to be making regular visits.
Well, and lots and lots of questions about how to get an appointment.
Yeah. So I think the key is to have your doctors refer you in with some whatever records they can, and make sure they specify the question is for MSA. Because if your doctor says balance problems or feeling faint, those are non-specific things that may get lost in the other 1,000 referrals that come in. So if they can, particularly one of our centers where we're on the lookout for MSA patients, and then of course we look at the records and try to figure out what it is that's needed. Is it help with the diagnosis? Is it someone who needs to get plugged in because they really haven't got a treatment plan, or is their local doctor comfortable with things but wants a little guidance? And we can do any of those things. So I just want to make that distinction between just kind of the routine business that we do in terms of helping diagnose things, helping to come up with treatment plans, and then this initiative, which is really how do we coordinate the more multidisciplinary approach to care and bring together all the pieces. And then that ties into telemedicine, which I think was the question. And that is, we do have some telemedicine tools. Unfortunately, some of the restrictions that were alleviated as far as telemedicine across state lines have gone away now. So it's become a bit more restrictive. I'm fortunate because Texas is a big state, so could be in Texas, and similarly with Florida, and Minnesota is big, but I think a lot of your patients don't come from Minnesota, and so it does represent a challenge. But telemedicine is an option that we use, and then some people do want to come and see us periodically, but can't, because of the distance, can't commit to regular visits, and that's fine. We work these things out. But we were just sort of today talking about a model of how we would ideally put this together and some of the things that we've learned.
Okay, so completely switching gears here. This is a specifically question for Dr. McFarland. Is there a roadmap? Do we all get the same bad symptoms and end up paralyzed and in bed?
Well, I think every MSA patient I've seen is different. I mean, I could say in general, unfortunately, we often say that it's pretty relentlessly progressive disease, and that's unfortunate, but patients do vary, okay? And I think we've kind of all hinted a little bit. I mean, depending on how you have progressed up to the point of seeing you kind of generally gives you a sense of how you may progress in the future. That's the best we have without actually having that crystal ball to kind of see where you're going to progress. Unfortunately, this is a progressive disease, and I think we all have to be honest and face that. We don't yet have a therapy that slows the disease down or yet provides a cure, and that's a very active area of research, and that's what many of the trials are there for and are coming out for. So, but as of today, we don't have that. So patients do progress. Disability does get worse over time. Balance issues become a major part of this disease, and people do progress from walkers to wheelchairs potentially bedbound at some point. So that's not the best news to hear, but it is part, and to be honest about the disease and have those discussions with patients. But we want to do everything we can to keep people as independent as possible. And that's, doing the supportive therapies that we have. Even some of the treatments that we have, where they're primarily symptom-based, can be very helpful too for patients. So our goal, best quality of life, as independent as possible till the very end.
And to that end, there have been some questions about therapy. Can therapy slow progression, or can symptoms actually improve?
Well, I think that at the present time, the disease doesn't improve, but we have many symptomatic medications, and we use them, and sometimes use them in combinations to deal with multiple different types of symptoms that patients have. So yes, and in that sense, things can get better. Physical therapy and speech therapy, swallowing therapy, all these things do help, and patients can improve. Right now, though, I think as you've been hearing, we don't have something to affect the course of the underlying disease. That's where we're at.
Yeah. This is actually an interesting question. My sister recently passed away. She had MSA, and the death certificate said nothing about MSA being a contributing factor to her death. Is it possible the ER doctor didn't know that she had that, or doesn't know about it? Is that normal if they would not put that on a death certificate? And does it matter?
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot of people, when they're doing death certificates, may just think in the immediate, like, was it a respiratory problem, pneumonia, or something that happened right then to the patient. So I'm sorry that your sister had this, and you all have had to see this so closely. And it likely was that MSA may have contributed to that, but since it wasn't necessarily the immediate cause of death, is why it's sometimes not put on that death certificate. And that's hard to know the implications of it not being on the death certificate. Does that mean that it doesn't get any, less attention or more attention? That's hard to say. But I'd be interested to know what my other colleagues think too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a problem in the sense that, if we were to go to the government and say, hey, MSA is a big problem, patients are dying of MSA, and they would pull this kind of data, they would underestimate what's going on. So yeah, and it's challenging because oftentimes patients don't die under the care of their MSA doctor, but at least in many cases, the patients who are with us in our MSA clinic, when they do pass away, whether it be at home or in hospice or something like that, those death certificates often come to me. And of course, I like to think I code them correctly. Doesn't always happen, but I think that's another advantage of being, kind of connected, and us taking some responsibility for that person as a patient right to the end.
Well, I would point out that Queen Elizabeth's death certificate apparently says that she died from old age. So, there are varying degrees of specificity.
Sure.
I just read that today.
We don't have a cure for that one either.
I think that you make a good point, though. I mean, these certificates are important. I think in the end of the game, it's probably not to the individual, but it can be in the sense if you need that actually stated on the death certificate, that can be kind of be amended. But I think it's mostly important really for us who study disease, treat the disease, actually having an accurate count and prevalence of this disease is really important to have that on there. There's always this argument, even for Parkinson's. Did you die of Parkinson's disease? Well, yes, you did, from complications of disease. But the primary cause was probably the Parkinson's, was the MSA. Yes, there were other immediate causes. So it's really just important for us to make sure we understand the extent of this disease, and for future research, it's important in that sense. So,
I actually do not know of anybody who's tried to get a death certificate changed after the fact.
I don't know either.
So, but it's an interesting issue. And actually someone just commented, but it's not 100% confirmed until after a brain autopsy. So you don't really know. Let's see. All right, so questions about diet. There is going to be a nutrition session later in the day, but someone asked if there has, let me try to find the question again. Have there been any studies with intermittent fasting as a treatment?
I don't know of any studies on diet. I think what you'll hear about in the nutrition talk is some general principles, but also some specific things related to MSA, mostly related to swallowing, related to carbohydrate loading that can affect blood pressure, sort of practical things as opposed to dietary changes that may have impact on disease progression and so on. But that's a great point, and I think we're sort of just scratching the surface of how diet affects diseases, and certainly a lot of the data suggests that these alpha-synuclein diseases like MSA and Parkinson's disease, there's a gut connection. There's a connection to the intestines and digestion, but we're not quite smart enough to know what that is yet.
Yeah, and people keep asking in the chat session whether they can get a copy of the letter. I think that you, Steve, talked about because people want to be able to use that.
Yeah, I think that's fine. We can share it through the MSA Coalition if you like.
Fabulous. Okay, so we will, and we in turn will share it with you guys.
So we had tried putting that in our paper, and they made us cut down
the
number of figures. That didn't get published.
Well, I would point out another thing, which is not quite the same as the letter, but every state has a slightly different form. In Massachusetts, it's called a MOLST, and in some places it's called a POLST. And you can ask your doctor about that. It basically tells your end of life wishes. But having both would not be a bad idea. And for that matter, I personally highly recommend it's a website and a questionnaire called the Conversation Project, which helps you sit down with your family and talk about what you want if you're ever faced with a serious illness, which of course this certainly is. And it helps get everybody on the same page. And I've seen families fractured over end of life care, which is just awful. And if there's ever a time you all ought to be together, this would be the time. So it's really better to get those conversations started early, even though they're not fun, they're hard. Okay, let's see. Somebody who says, so Dr. Laura Mishley's research has shown that persons with PD who eat a plant-based diet have a slower progression. I wonder if the same would be true for MSA. I think bring this up in the nutrition session because that's really where it's better placed. But a number of questions about nutritional studies, and you folks kind of addressed that. But I think those are questions that are better placed in the nutrition conversation. Okay. Oh, this is an interesting question. I've been denied by 4 clinical trials because they all want early stage MSA patients, and I have been denied compassionate care. I'm still walking with a walker. I'm willing to try anything. How do I get a drug or trial therapy compassionate use? It's a problem we hear about a lot because frequently patients are no longer early stage by the time they're even diagnosed.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I could probably. I could comment quickly on it. Probably Dr. Clausen's talk kind of went over a lot about clinical trials, but every clinical trial has its focus. So they have their inclusion and exclusion criteria, and they're looking for specific patients. That is part of a clinical trial, and one of the reasons for that is really just to focus the trial as well as to reduce confounders in a trial. So that's kind of unfortunate, and it is true that many of the trials currently that we have, particularly looking at disease modification, do target earlier stages of disease. And I think part of the focus of that is really because we want to basically target people who have early disease so we can stop it at that point. The other half of that question is sort of what happens when we're too late? And I think some of the questions, as a brain degenerates, you get to a later stage of disease, can we really modify the disease at that stage? And that's kind of part of the logic and thinking for many researchers. So it is unfortunate that many studies increasingly for Parkinson's, for MSA, and other degenerative diseases are increasingly focusing earlier and earlier on earlier disease stages. So it is unfortunate, and I totally acknowledge, I think, whoever asked the question, that many studies are leaving behind a little bit of the more advanced disease patients, and what else can we do for them? And that may be more of a focus of symptomatic disease, and it might also be part of just a major fact that this is a degenerative disease and we can't repair the brain once it's become more damaged. So the brain doesn't regenerate, unfortunately. It's just a reality of things. But I just want to tell the person who asked the question that you should talk to your physician, reach out to others. Some of us, we can probably guide you to trials that might fit you in particular, depending on your symptoms. Many of the new trials that are out don't exclude patients who can walk with a walker, let's say 25 feet. And that's not a very tough standard, actually, to meet. But for some patients, it is. But just reach out to us, and we can help guide you to the right trials.
I'll also say, too, I think that was excellent. But that is another reason why we really need these centers of care, because since we don't have a cure, we should still be trying to focus on things that we can try and help with these symptoms and day-to-day life. And so one more reason why these centers of excellence can be helpful, since I share that frustration that those trial criteria can be very restrictive, even though it is somewhat necessary for the scientific approach.
Okay, a couple quick questions here. How best to manage drug side effects, which can exacerbate MSA symptoms? I call this the whack-a-mole theory. You fix one problem and another one pops up.
Well, I think that question fits nicely into what we're talking about in this session, and that is if you can get all the doctors who are part of the care talking to each other, that makes it a lot easier, because then you don't have the urologist giving them a medicine that's going to make them pass out more, or us giving them a medicine for their blood pressure that make them unable to urinate. So even if it's just like in our case, our urologist doesn't come to our MSA clinic, but we have one urologist who knows about MSA very well and is not going to put people on drugs, and in many cases will move to catheterization, because that's ultimately what they need, rather than mess around with medications that have side effects. So that just, again, is another reason why, well, this is true for any disease, that the doctors need to talk to each other so they're not at cross purposes.
I have another medication question. I'm going to try to interpret this. Is there anything it says dopa boost. I think dopamine, is there any way to boost dopamine if you don't want to start taking levodopa? I'm sort of editorializing that a little bit.
I think the best way to really get those dopamine levels up is the levodopa. Mm-hmm. It's what's converted into dopamine once it's in the brain.
Yeah, there are other medications out there that we call dopamine replacement type therapies, but I think many of us have found them less beneficial and fraught with more side effects. So again, it's kind of like Dr. Benio said, the balancing act, that we kind of play with the drug effects and adverse effects and interactions with other drugs. So it's a complicated kind of formula sometimes with each patient.
Okay, and then the answer will be interesting to this question. Any thoughts about the cause of MSA? Lots of thoughts.
I think we're all shocked. We don't. I don't think we have the
lots of thoughts, but no answers, right?
Yeah, I think we're all stuck on this one. I think we all think about these degenerative diseases as having potentially genetic factors, but to be honest, actually compared to Parkinson's disease and other degenerative disorders, genetic searches haven't really been all that revealing in MSA, which is a bit surprising. Now there is some genes, COX-2 gene has been shown, but limited to Japan. So genetic factors have been really hard to find in MSA, so it's largely sporadic disease. So now the question is, so what about environmental factors or other things? So anything from stress to other environmental factors, and we still don't have that smoking gun yet. So the answer is we don't know. We know a lot what happens once the disease starts and pathologically, but we don't really know what sets it off. I don't know if my colleagues have a better answer, but I guess I'm going to say I don't know yet.
And part of the problem with that too is that MSA is rare. It doesn't feel rare if someone has it or a family member has it, but because it's so rare, it's hard to really pinpoint. We do have some suspicion about different susceptibilities and maybe different factors that a person may be exposed to over their lifetime may contribute, but it's just really hard to study on a big level to really make those links.
Okay, and then a couple questions. One about depression. This individual says, as a psychiatrist, I'd like to put a word in to be cautious about overly diagnosing major depressive disorder. Antidepressants may be problematic in MSA, even if indicated, and many MSA symptoms mimic depression: low energy, poor appetite, sleep disturbance, etc. It's important to distinguish between demoralization and depression. So that's not really a question, that's more of a statement, but any comments on that?
I would say I agree with that. And that's where I'm lucky to partner with some of our palliative specialists who are really good about diving into that and help sorting out different clues from depression and demoralization and really getting, see if it's more talking with a psychologist or a therapist for more that demoralization aspect. So I would agree with that.
Yeah, one of the things that anecdotally I see a lot among MSA patients is apathy. It's not really depression. It's just like, I don't care. Do you want to eat this? I don't care. Do you want to go outside? I don't care. And that's it's certainly better than being fully depressed, but it's also challenging for those people around that person because it's like having a perpetual teenager. I don't care. Okay, then a whole bunch of questions about supplements and vitamins. Is anything recommended?
I don't think there's any, consensus recommendations about that. I mean, one of the things our dietitian does is look for holes in the diet, things that because of swallowing issues or whatever, people are just not eating meat or vegetables anymore, then there may need to be some supplementation around that. But I don't, at least in our practice, not a specific, we don't have a specific set of recommendations around supplementation.
I would say that I have seen a couple of situations where vitamin B, I think B12 deficiency looks a lot like MSA. So that's not saying that we should all take vitamin B12, but that if you haven't been tested for that, please make sure that that's in the mix for you before you get too depressed about your MSA diagnosis. We are being told we're out of time. We have to write up.
Is that, yeah. So, sorry. But you make a good point, Carol, that part of the initial evaluation should be looking at some of these things. And I usually talk, if they're concerned about vitamins, is have they had any sort of the more common things checked, like vitamin D? People are more inside these days. Even in the sunny state of Florida, I see a lot of vitamin D deficiency, not specific to MSA, but just in general. And B vitamins, low B vitamins, particularly B1 or even B12, can cause blood pressure issues, particularly orthostatic hypotension. So something we like. So, but yes, no specific vitamin recommendations from our part.
Okay, we are being told that we're out of time. So I apologize if you had a question that did not get answered. And some of these, it looks like you could slip them into a different session. There is specifically a question for Dr. McFarland, which I will pop in here. Since Scripps Research Institute is now part of the University of Florida, is there a chance that a branch of your department will open in Palm Beach Gardens or Jupiter?
Shannon, UF Health is working and they are expanding. So that's all I can say right now. But come see us. I was gonna just in the last few seconds, I saw a bunch of questions about how you reach us, how you get to our clinics. And I would just say we all probably have websites, and hopefully they'll be also on the MSA Coalition website soon as well, to help find places. But reach out to us. We will help facilitate getting appointments if you just reach out. I know my email is available online at our website, so that's one way to do it. Just contact us.
And so, just to recapitulate, Dr. McFarland's at University of Florida in Gainesville. I hope you're not getting slammed by a hurricane. Dr. Bernino is at UT Southwest in Dallas. And Dr. Kuhn is at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, because there are multiple Mayo Clinics. So with simply that information, you should be able to find all of these people. And at that, I think, let's just see what we got here. Thank you. We have lots of thank yous. People are very grateful, and I'm very grateful for your time and your expertise. It's fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right.